Western States, Hardrock, Leadville, and UTMB.
Big ones.
We've got a whole stack of opinions here, these iconic ultras. Each one a bucket list item, it seems, for so many runners. Now, what I think is so fascinating about this discussion is that it goes beyond just like listing favorites. You know, it really gets into what makes each race unique, what draws runners to specific events, and then ultimately what those choices kind of reveal about their priorities as ultra runners.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes it so interesting to dive into.
If you could magically get into all four of these legendary races, which would you choose? And I gotta admit, I was really surprised by the variety of opinion.
You have some runners that are just laser focused on Hardrock.
Right.
They're captivated by its challenging terrain, and it's almost like this mythical status.
Yeah.
And then you've got those who are just UTMB obsessed. They're drawn to that allure of running through 3 countries. Those stunning alpine views.
And then there's Leadville.
Yeah.
I noticed a few comments that weren't exactly, you know, singing his praises.
Right.
Is it just not as popular as the others?
You know, it's not necessarily a matter of popularity. I think it's more about the specific challenge that Leadville presents.
Okay.
And remember, we're talking about running at altitudes where oxygen levels
Oh, right.
are 66 to 70% of what you'd find at sea level. So this isn't just about tough terrain.
Right.
It's a whole different physiological battle.
I've always wondered how runners even begin to prepare for something like that, like months of altitude training.
Well, for most runners, it's not really practical to live and train at that altitude year-round, but they do incorporate strategies like altitude simulation chambers or spending blocks of time training at higher elevation to help their bodies adapt.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, this brings up another fascinating point from the thread. One user mentioned completing a Grand Slam by running Western States, but is there an officially recognized Grand Slam in ultramarathoning? I have to admit, I've never even heard of that.
There isn't a single universally accepted Grand Slam like you'd find in tennis or something. But the idea of grouping these iconic races together definitely exists. Some runners, they consider the big 4 we're discussing as an informal Grand Slam.
Right.
While others will create personal lists
Right.
based on criteria like distance, terrain, or even content.
So it's more about runners creating their own personal challenges and goals within the sport.
Exactly. It's all about pushing those boundaries and testing themselves against races that hold a special significance to them.
And this ties back to that initial question of why certain races resonate more with some runners than others. So we've got the challenge aspect, but this thread also dives into what makes a race truly legendary. And it seems like it goes beyond just how tough it is.
Absolutely. The aura of a race is a big part of it.
Right.
You take UTMB, for instance. The scenery is undeniably breathtaking. You're running through the Alps, you're crossing borders, experiencing these incredible vistas. But some runners find the sheer scale of the event with thousands of participants to be a drawback. They prefer the more intimate feel of races like Hardrock or Western States.
It's like choosing between like a massive music festival and a small exclusive concert. Both have their appeal, but the experience is so fundamentally different. And speaking of experience, we can't forget about the legendary aid stations at Western States. Runners rave about the level of support, the incredible volunteers, and almost like a festive atmosphere. So it's not just about getting from point A to point B. It's about the whole journey and the community that supports you along the way. And this brings us to the question of whether the big 4 are truly the undisputed top 4, or if there were other races out there worthy of a spot on the ultra running Mount Rushmore. We've got Array, Wyoming Range, Cocodona, Badwater, even the Spartathlon in Europe getting shout-outs. So what makes these races stand out from the pack?
You know, what's fascinating is how each of these races has carved out its own unique niche in the ultra world. Like you mentioned, Array and the Wyoming Range, both known for their remote and rugged courses. These are races that truly test a runner's self-sufficiency and their wilderness navigation skills.
It's a different kind of challenge.
Well, absolutely.
Not just about the physical endurance, but the mental fortitude to navigate these wild and unpredictable landscapes. Then you've got Cocodona,
right?
A behemoth of a race at over 200 miles through the Arizona desert. The heat and the sheer distance, making this one a true test of human resilience.
It is.
And speaking of extreme condition, there's Badwater, infamous for running through Death Valley in the peak of summer heat.
Crazy.
I can't even imagine running a mile in that kind of heat, let alone 135. These races seem to attract runners who are drawn to pushing their limits in the most extreme ways possible.
It's almost like they're seeking out these trials by fire,
Right.
ultimate tests of human endurance.
Wow, and then you have the Spartathlon, steeped in history and tradition. Retracing the steps of Pheidippides, that legendary Greek messenger,
Right.
that's one where the historical context adds like a whole other layer to the challenge. Runners aren't just competing against the distance and the terrain. They're connecting with a story that's thousands of years old.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that really struck me was this mention of runners moving away from these mega races
Okay.
in favor of smaller, more local events.
Interesting.
One user specifically highlighted the teen away
Okay.
as an example. So what's driving this shift?
Well, I think it speaks to a desire for something more authentic, something more connected to the roots of ultra running. Some runners feel that the massive commercial races, while impressive in scale,
Have lost some of their soul.
is it a reaction against that commercialization we were talking about earlier?
It's certainly a part of it. These smaller races often offer a greater sense of community, a feeling of that shared experience that can be harder to find in a race with thousands of participants. You're not just a number. You're part of a tribe.
So it's like they're seeking a return to those core values of ultra running. The challenge, the camaraderie, the connection to nature without all the hype and fanfare.
Exactly.
And these smaller races often highlight local trails and communities, offering runners a chance to discover these hidden gems they might not otherwise experience. Now, while we've been focusing on the American ultra scene, this thread also touches on the international perspective, particularly European runners.
Seems they're less drawn to the American races, except maybe for Western states. Any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, for European runners, UTMB holds a special place. It's in their backyard, so to speak. And it offers a similar level of prestige and challenge as the American races. Plus, that whole running through 3 countries thing is a pretty big draw.
But even with UTMB's popularity, some European runners expressed concerns about its organization.
The main criticism was around commercialization. Some felt that UTMB had become too focused on profit and had lost touch with the runners and the spirit of the event. They echoed sentiments we've heard about some American races. Too big, too corporate, too much about the bottom line.
So this tension between commercialization and grassroots values isn't just an American phenomenon. It seems to be playing out on a global scale within the ultra running community. And it raises some important questions about the future of the sport. Can these massive commercial events coexist with the smaller community-driven races? Or will there be a growing divide between the two? On the one hand, these big races bring in revenue, media attention, sponsorships, which can help grow the sport as a whole. Exposure can inspire new runners and push the boundaries of what's possible in ultra running. On the other hand, there's a risk of these mega races overshadowing the smaller, more authentic events that are so vital to the heart and soul of the sport.
For sure.
And what about the impact on the local communities hosting these races?
Right.
One user brought up the economic benefits UTMB brings to the towns and villages along its route.
That's a valid point.
Right. These big events can be a significant boost to local economies,
Oh, yeah.
especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
They bring in tourism, create jobs, support local businesses. But there's also the potential for these events to overwhelm small communities,
Right.
strain resources,
Yeah.
and disrupt the local way of life. So it's a complex issue with no easy answers. Sounds like there needs to be a balance, a way for these big commercial races to coexist with the smaller, more community-focused events without sacrificing the core values of ultra running.